Ethan stood silently before his mother Eleanor's grave as the faint light of dusk filtered through the cemetery. The place was deserted, save for the wind whistling through rows of cold tombstones. It had been 3 years since her death, yet the haunting questions in Ethan's mind refused to fade. Eleanor's death was officially ruled a heart attack, but Ethan had never accepted it. He remembered her eyes in her final days, not the eyes of someone succumbing to illness, but those of a woman hiding something. Ethan knelt, resting his hand on the gravestone inscribed with Eleanor Marie Hayes, 1965 to 2022. Memories flooded back. At her funeral, he'd stood in this very spot, watching her coffin lower into the earth. What he couldn't forget was the strange black rose clutched in her hand. No one knew where it came from or why it was there. His father, Richard, had shrugged it off, suggesting it might have been a gift from a relative. Ethan didn't buy it. His mother hated roses, especially black ones. She'd once told him they symbolized betrayal. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat in his small room, the desk lamp casting light on old photos of his mother. One showed her standing by a piano, beaming with a radiant smile. Another captured her in the garden, hands dirty with soil, eyes sparkling with joy. Then he recalled the last time he saw her alive, sitting on the sofa, holding a teacup, her gaze distant, as if peering into a world he couldn't reach. Ethan stood and stepped onto the balcony. The cold wind carried the damp scent of the garden below. His eyes landed on the shovel in the garage corner. A crazy idea flashed through his mind: dig up her grave. He knew it was illegal, knew he'd have no excuse if caught, but he needed answers. The black rose, her sudden death, her final look, all pieces of a puzzle he couldn't ignore. Late at night, Ethan drove to the cemetery, the shovel and a flashlight resting on the back seat. Dressed in a dark jacket and hood, he parked in a secluded spot and killed the headlights. The moon hung faintly in the sky, casting just enough light to guide him. His heart pounded as he approached the grave. Kneeling before it, he whispered, "Mom, I'm sorry, but I have to know." He began digging, each thrust of the shovel sinking into the soft earth. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but he didn't stop. After nearly 2 hours, the oak coffin emerged under his flashlight's beam. Trembling, he pried it open. Though embalmed, Eleanor's body retained an eerie calm, as if she were merely asleep. Ethan's hands shook as he searched, unsure what he sought. Then he saw it. On her left wrist, beneath the shroud, was a small injection mark, faded but unmistakable. It wasn't from a hospital needle, he was certain. He snapped photos with his phone, then hastily reburied the coffin, erasing all traces before leaving. The next morning, he sought Dr. Riley, a private forensic expert he'd found online. A woman in her 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes behind thick glasses, Riley lived in a modest house with a makeshift lab. When Ethan shared his story and showed the photos, she frowned. "That injection mark isn't normal," she said, her voice low. "If your mother died of a heart attack, there's no reason for a needle there. I'd need tissue samples to confirm, but from the images, I suspect a rare poison." "Poison?" Ethan echoed, his voice trembling. "You mean she was murdered?" Riley nodded slowly. "Possibly. I'll need time to verify. But if you want the truth, start with that black rose you mentioned. It might be a key clue." Ethan left Riley's house with a storm of questions. The black rose, he tried to forget it, but now it was the center of his suspicions. He drove to the city library, digging through old botany books. After hours, he learned black roses weren't natural. They were bred or dyed, often used in rituals or as cryptic messages. He recalled a detail. His mother had worked part-time at a greenhouse in the suburbs when he was a child. Could that be the rose's origin? Ethan headed there. The greenhouse was now abandoned, its glass shattered, weeds choking the grounds. Inside, the air reeked of mold. Under his flashlight, he found old pots, some bearing traces of black dye. Searching further, he uncovered a small wooden box buried in the dirt. Inside was a thin, leather-bound diary, his mother's handwriting. The first page read, "If anyone finds this, know I tried to protect my family. Richard isn't the man I loved anymore. He's hiding something, and Vivian knows it." Ethan's blood ran cold. His father and Vivian, Eleanor's best friend, were involved in her death? He read on, each word a stab to his heart. Eleanor wrote of arguments with Richard, discovering his massive debts, and overhearing him and Vivian whisper about a perfect plan. He tucked the diary into his pocket, determined to dig deeper. As he left, he heard a strange sound, footsteps on dry earth. He spun around, but saw only darkness and the wind. Danger lurked, but he couldn't stop. Ethan knew he couldn't face this alone. He needed someone experienced. He turned to Detective Daniel Miller, a grizzled man with salt and pepper hair and piercing eyes. A 20-year police veteran, Miller now worked freelance, taking cases the force ignored. When Ethan entered Miller's cramped office, the detective was smoking, feet propped on his desk. "What do you want?" Miller asked, voice rough. Ethan laid the diary and injection photos on the table, recounting everything from the black rose to the grave. Miller listened without interrupting, though skepticism glinted in his eyes. "You dug up your mother's grave?" Miller said coolly. "You know that's a serious crime, right?" "I know," Ethan replied. "But I had no choice. She didn't die naturally. I have proof." Miller flipped through the diary, pausing at the perfect plan entry. "All right," he said after a long silence. "I'll help you. But we do this my way. No more reckless moves." Miller agreed to start by investigating the poison Riley suspected. He called an old lab contact to check rare toxins. While waiting, they returned to the greenhouse. This time, they found a slip of paper wedged in the wood, a receipt for chemicals from Sterling Labs. The name rang a bell, but Ethan couldn't place it. Miller and Ethan sought more witnesses. They visited Eleanor's old neighborhood, knocking on doors. Most residents shook their heads, claiming no memory of the night she died. But Henry, an elderly gardener living a few houses down, agreed to talk. Henry sat in a worn armchair, hands trembling as he poured tea. "I remember that night," he said. "I was watering plants when I saw a strange car park outside Eleanor's house. A black sedan with tinted windows. I didn't see who was inside, but they stayed for about 10 minutes before leaving." "Any license plate?" Miller asked. Henry shook his head. "Too dark. But I saw a small symbol on the door, like a stylized S." Ethan and Miller exchanged looks. "Sterling Labs," Ethan whispered. Could Dr. Sterling be tied to his mother's death? Before they left, Henry grabbed Ethan's arm. "Be careful, son. I don't know what's going on, but your mother's death wasn't simple." On the drive back, Miller got a call from his lab friend. "That poison you asked about," the voice said, "matches a murder from 10 years ago. A businessman poisoned, case unsolved." The chemical came from Sterling Labs. Ethan clenched his fists. The pieces were falling into place, but the road ahead promised danger. Ethan and Miller sat in the car, streetlights casting faint glows through the windshield. Eleanor's diary rested on Ethan's lap, her scrawled words whispering from the past. After meeting Henry, they had a new lead, Sterling Labs, linked to the poison and the mystery car. But who was behind it all? Miller tapped the steering wheel, eyes weary. "I worked that case 10 years ago," he said. "Harold Grayson, a businessman poisoned in his office. No prints, no witnesses. Sterling Labs was suspected, but we lacked evidence to pin them. Case went cold." Ethan turned to him. "Who's Dr. Sterling?" "A ghost," Miller replied. "Real name Victor Sterling, ex-surgeon turned chemist. Vanished after the Grayson case, but rumors say he still runs Sterling Labs through proxies." Ethan nodded, piecing it together. If Sterling was involved, Richard and Vivian might be the link. The diary exposed their betrayal, but he needed hard proof. He suggested confronting his father, a meeting he'd avoided too long. They drove to Richard's grand house in the suburbs. Once a family home, it now felt like a hollow shell. Richard answered the door, eyes bloodshot from liquor. "Ethan, what are you doing here this late?" "We need to talk," Ethan said, stepping inside uninvited. Miller followed, scanning the room. Expensive paintings and leather furniture hinted at wealth Ethan knew his father couldn't afford. Ethan slammed the diary on the table, opened to the perfect plan page. "Mom knew everything," he said, voice shaking with rage. "What did you and Vivian do to her?" Richard paled but regained composure. "You're crazy, Ethan. Your mom died of a heart attack. You can't blame me for some scribbles." Miller cut in, voice icy. "We've got evidence of an injection on her wrist. The poison traces back to Sterling Labs. What do you know about Victor Sterling?" Richard laughed, but it sounded forced. "Never heard of a Sterling. You're wasting your time." Ethan wanted to lunge at him, but Miller signaled calm. They left without answers, though Ethan saw it. Richard was hiding something, and he was scared. The next morning, Miller got results from Dr. Riley. She'd analyzed tissue Ethan took from Eleanor's body, an illegal act she'd agreed to out of professional curiosity. It's tetrodotoxin, Riley said over the phone. Stops the heart in minutes. Leaves no obvious trace without deep testing. Sterling Labs was suspected of producing it legally for research, but it's clearly been misused. Miller jotted notes, then turned to Ethan. Tetrodotoxin isn't something just anyone can buy. If your dad's involved, he's got deep ties to Sterling. Ethan nodded, mind reeling. He didn't want to believe his father killed his mother, but the evidence pointed that way. They decided to investigate Vivian, the other corner of Eleanor's betrayal triangle. Vivian lived in a plush downtown apartment. She opened the door with a fake smile. Ethan, it's been ages. How are you? Fine, Ethan snapped. But Mom isn't. What do you know about her death? Vivian frowned, but her eyes flickered with panic. I don't know what you mean. Eleanor was my best friend. I was devastated when she passed. Miller stepped forward, calm but cutting. We know about your affair with Richard. And Sterling Labs. If you don't talk, we'll make you. Vivian laughed, but it trembled. You've got nothing on me. I had no part in Eleanor's death. Before leaving, Ethan dropped a line. Mom wrote about you in her diary. You won't get away, Vivian. On the way back, Miller got a text from his police contact. Dug into Richard Hayes' finances, it read. He owes over $2 million from gambling and bad investments. Eleanor had a $3 million life insurance policy. There's your motive. Ethan's throat went dry. Money. It was all about money. Ethan couldn't sleep that night. He sat in his room, reopening his mother's diary. A late entry caught his eye. I met Sterling. He's no doctor. He's a devil. If I don't act, Richard will destroy everything. Eleanor knew Sterling, but when had she met him, and why? The next morning, Ethan and Miller went to Sterling Labs, now an abandoned building in an industrial suburb. The front was chained shut, but Miller broke the lock with a nearby rod. Inside, the air stank of old chemicals. They found broken vials, charred papers, and an old photo on the floor. Victor Sterling, dark hair, eyes cold as a snake's. In a corner, Ethan discovered a notebook detailing chemical transactions, including a tetrodotoxin batch sold to R.H. Richard Hayes. The date matched the week before Eleanor's death. Ethan's heart clenched. As they left, a black car sped past, nearly hitting Miller. Ethan shouted, but it vanished around a corner. He glimpsed a stylized S on the door, Henry's description. We're being watched, Miller said, voice tight. Sterling knows we're close. 2 days later, Miller called Ethan. Henry was dead. Found in his home, wrists slashed in an obvious staged suicide. Miller didn't buy it. No note, no signs of depression, he said at the scene. Someone silenced him. Ethan stared at Henry's small house, guilt weighing him down. The kind old man had helped them, and now he'd paid the price. Miller found faint tire marks outside, matching the sedans. It's a warning, Miller said. We're stirring a hornet's nest, Ethan. Want to stop? No, Ethan replied firmly. They killed Mom, then Henry. I won't stop until they pay. Miller nodded, though worry creased his face. They decided to accelerate the investigation, focusing on Richard and Vivian. Miller suggested a trap, spread word of a new witness to force their enemies into action. The rumor went out via Miller's press contact. New witness reveals truth about Eleanor Hayes' death. Hours later, an anonymous tip came. Richard and Vivian would attend a secret auction in the suburbs the next night. They're selling Eleanor's assets, the tip said. Don't miss it. Ethan and Miller prepared meticulously. The site was an old riverside warehouse, dim lights piercing the fog. Inside, dozens of masked figures murmured as items hit the auction block. Ethan spotted one of his mother's paintings. She'd made it when he was a kid. Now Richard was selling it like it meant nothing. Richard stood on the platform, Vivian beside him, chatting with buyers. Ethan's fists clenched, but Miller held him back. Wait, he whispered. We need proof. A tall, thin man emerged from the shadows, masked but with a chilling voice. Everything ready, Richard? He asked. Ethan froze. It was Sterling, he was sure. But before they could act, the lights went out, and a scream pierced the darkness. The scream echoed through the warehouse, mingling with crashing objects and chaotic footsteps. Ethan lunged forward, searching for Miller in the dark, but the detective's hand yanked him back. Stay calm, Miller hissed, voice taut. We don't know what's happening. The lights flickered on, dim but enough to reveal chaos. A masked man lay dead on the floor, blood pooling from a knife in his chest. The crowd scattered, leaving Richard, Vivian, and Sterling stunned on the platform. Ethan realized this wasn't their plan. Someone had struck first. Sterling roared, voice hoarse. Who dared do this? He pulled a gun from his coat, scanning the room. His eyes locked on Ethan and Miller, glinting with menace. You, he said, advancing. You've ruined everything. Before he could fire, Miller shoved Ethan down, drawing his own weapon. A shot rang out, grazing Sterling's shoulder, forcing him back. Richard and Vivian bolted for the rear exit, abandoning Sterling. But he didn't flee. He laughed, a cold, twisted sound, then vanished behind crates. Ethan stood, heart racing. We have to chase them, he yelled, but Miller restrained him. No, Ethan. It's a trap. Sterling wants us to follow. They checked the dead man. Miller lifted the mask, revealing a stranger, likely Sterling's lackey. In his pocket was a scribbled note. Plan changed. Eliminate Ethan. Ethan's spine chilled. They didn't just want his mother dead. Now they wanted him gone. Ethan and Miller left the warehouse before police arrived, taking the note and renewed resolve. In the car, Miller analyzed. Sterling's not alone, he said. That killing was a message. He's losing control, and someone's unhappy. Ethan nodded, mind on Richard and Vivian. They'd fled, but not far. He suggested tracking his father's bank accounts. If Richard was selling Eleanor's assets, the money would show. Miller called an old hacker friend to trace recent transactions. While waiting, Ethan reopened the diary. A late entry stood out. Vivian came yesterday, crying and apologizing. She said Richard forced her, but I don't believe her. I recorded it. It's in the piano box. Ethan jolted. A recording? He hadn't thought to check the old piano at his father's house. They drove back. The house was dark, empty. Ethan entered the living room, where the dusty piano sat. He opened the lid's compartment, finding a small recorder. Playing it, Vivian's shaky voice emerged. Eleanor, I didn't want this. Richard said it was the only way to clear the debts. Sterling would handle the rest. Then Eleanor, cold. You chose the wrong side, Vivian. I won't forgive you. Ethan stopped it, hands trembling. This was proof, vivid evidence of betrayal. Miller clapped his shoulder. We've got them. Now we just need Sterling. Miller's phone rang. The hacker reported. Richard transferred $1 million offshore an hour ago from a downtown hotel. Rain poured as Ethan and Miller reached the hotel, an old building with flickering neon. They entered the lobby, water dripping from their coats. Miller asked the receptionist about Richard, but she shook her head. No one by that name here. Ethan didn't believe her. He noticed a guard staring from a corner. When they approached, the man bolted out the back. Miller pursued, while Ethan raced upstairs, instinct pulling him higher. Room 304. Door ajar. Ethan pushed in, finding Richard by the window, glass in hand. He turned, eyes tired but unsurprised. You're here, he said. I knew you wouldn't give up. You killed Mom. Ethan growled, advancing. For money, for Vivian, for Sterling. Got anything to say? Richard laughed dryly. Your mom was too stubborn, Ethan. She found my debts, the plan with Sterling. I didn't want her dead. That was Vivian's idea. But I didn't stop it. Ethan lunged, punching his father's face. Richard fell, blood streaming from his nose. You don't get it, he yelled. I had no way out. Miller entered, pulling Ethan back. Enough, he said, cuffing Richard. But then Vivian appeared at the door, gun in hand, eyes wild. You can't do this, she screamed, aiming at Ethan. I won't let it all collapse. A shot rang out, but Miller was faster. He shoved Ethan aside, firing back. The bullet hit Vivian's shoulder, dropping her gun. She clutched the wound, groaning, but her glare burned with hate. Ethan stood, breathless. Why, Vivian? Mom saw you as a sister. Vivian sneered, voice weak. A sister? Eleanor always looked down on me. When Richard needed money, I saw my chance. Sterling promised to wipe it all clean if we worked together. Miller searched the room, finding a suitcase with documents, Eleanor's insurance policy, Sterling Labs invoices, and a detailed poisoning plan. A chilling note read, after Eleanor, Ethan's next. Use tetrodotoxin. Set the trap at the auction. They meant to kill me there, Ethan whispered. The masked man's death, it was their mistake. Miller nodded. Sterling wanted you gone, but it fell apart. He's panicking. Police arrived to arrest Richard and Vivian. As they left, Ethan watched his father being led away, feeling hollow. Richard was no longer the man he'd loved, just a traitor, a murderer. But Sterling was still out there. The fight wasn't over. 2 days later, Miller got a tip from an anonymous source. Sterling was hiding in an underground lab a few miles from the city. Ethan and Miller geared up for the final showdown, armed with weapons, a recorder, and determination. The site was an old bunker beneath an abandoned factory. They descended, the air damp and chemical-laden. Dim bulbs illuminated Sterling, standing in the center, wearing a white lab coat, holding a vial of clear liquid. "Welcome," Sterling said calmly. "I knew you'd come." Ethan advanced, fury blazing. "You killed my mom. You're behind it all." Sterling laughed. "Yes, I injected her with tetrodotoxin. But I didn't plan it. Your father needed money to pay debts. Vivian wanted Eleanor gone for him. I was just the hired hand. The black rose was my signature." Miller aimed his gun. "Drop the vial." Sterling shrugged, eyes sly. He smashed it. Not poison, but a smoke device. White clouds billowed, blinding them. Ethan lunged, but Sterling's footsteps faded through a hidden exit. As the smoke cleared, they found a laptop left behind. A video played, Eleanor, bound, facing Sterling. "You can't hide forever," she said, voice faint but firm. "Ethan will find the truth." The video ended, leaving Ethan frozen, tears streaming down his face. Ethan stood in the stifling bunker, smoke swirling at his feet. The video of his mother, her last moments, burned into his mind like an unhealing scar. Sterling had escaped, but Ethan knew he couldn't be far. Miller checked the secret exit, finding stairs to the surface. They raced up, guns ready, driven by resolve. The stairs opened to a desolate field, rain turning the ground to mud. Lightning flashed, revealing Sterling sprinting toward a black car, the sedan with the S symbol. "There he is," Ethan yelled, charging despite Miller's shout. Sterling turned, hurling another vial. This time it was real. Toxic smoke erupted as it shattered, the acrid stench choking them. Miller yanked Ethan back, both coughing violently. When the smoke cleared, the car was gone, and Ethan slammed his fist into the mud, rain mixing with blood from his torn hand. "We lost him," he roared, voice breaking with rage and despair. Miller gripped his shoulder. "Not quite. He's desperate, and desperate men leave tracks. We'll find him." They returned to the bunker, gathering evidence. The laptop, papers, and a note dropped from Sterling's coat, an address for a mountain house hours away. Ethan clutched it, eyes blazing. "This is our last shot." Ethan and Miller drove through the night, the mountain road jolting their old car. The address led to a log cabin hidden in pine woods, faint light seeping from the windows. They parked a distance away, approaching on foot to avoid detection. Ethan peered through a window, seeing Sterling at a table, phone in hand, voice urgent. "Richard and Vivian are caught. You have to get me out now." He was talking to someone, a hidden ally. Miller signaled Ethan to wait, but he couldn't hold back. He kicked the door open, aiming at Sterling. "Don't move," he shouted. Sterling flinched, dropping the phone, but quickly smirked. "You're faster than I thought, Ethan," he said. "But you don't know the full story." "Shut it," Ethan snapped. "You confessed in the video." Sterling laughed. "Yes, I poisoned her. But I didn't orchestrate it. Richard and Vivian did. For money, for love. I was just their tool." Miller entered, cuffing Sterling. "Who's behind you? Who were you calling?" Sterling stayed silent, but Ethan grabbed the phone, hitting speaker. A deep voice said, "Victor, don't let them take you alive. We can't expose the network." The call cut off. Ethan clenched his fists. "Network? Who else is involved?" Sterling shrugged. "You'll never know. I'm just a small link in a bigger game." A week later, Richard, Vivian, and Sterling faced trial in the city courthouse. Ethan sat in the front row, eyes fixed on the three who destroyed his mother's life. The packed courtroom buzzed as reporters swarmed the sensational case. The prosecutor presented evidence: Eleanor's diary, Vivian's recorded confession, Sterling Lab's documents, and Eleanor's final video. Richard stared at the floor, avoiding Ethan. Vivian sobbed, but no one bought her tears. Sterling sat stone-faced, as if resigned. Ethan took the stand, voice trembling but steady. My mom wasn't just their victim. She was the strongest person I knew. She tried to protect me, our family, but they took her for money and greed. I just want justice for her. As he stepped down, Richard stood. Ethan, I'm sorry, he choked out. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I loved your mom, but I messed up. Ethan turned away, silent. The apology came too late. After 3 hours, the jury delivered verdicts. Richard and Vivian got life for first-degree murder. Sterling received the death penalty for his key role in criminal past. As he was led away, he whispered to Ethan, "Think it's over? Wait and see." Post-trial, Ethan returned to the family home. He entered the living room, where the piano stood silent. Sitting, he pressed a key, a mournful note echoing memories of his mother's lessons. In a drawer, he found a letter in her handwriting. Ethan, if you read this, forgive me for hiding so much. I just wanted you free from your father's darkness. Be strong, my son. Ethan folded it, tears falling. His mother hadn't just fought external enemies, but secrets she couldn't share. He decided to sell the house, using the money for a charity in Eleanor's name, aiding crime-affected families. Miller visited one rainy afternoon. You okay? He asked. Ethan nodded. I found peace. But I know something's still out there. Sterling wasn't the end. Miller smiled faintly. You're more like your mom than you know. Call me if you need an ally. Ethan stood at his mother's grave again, placing a white flower, her favorite, on the stone. I did it, Mom, he whispered. I'll live well, like you wanted. The wind blew, bringing a relief he hadn't felt in 3 years. But as he turned to leave, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Sterling was just a pawn. The network lives. Watch yourself, Ethan Hayes. Attached was a photo of a black rose, identical to the one in his mother's hand at her funeral. Ethan stared at the screen, heart pounding. Justice was served, but the darkness lingered. He clenched his fists, knowing his fight might not be over. He left the cemetery, gaze resolute. Whoever they were, he'd find them. For his mother, for himself, and for the secrets yet to be uncovered.